Je suis très heureuse d'être avec vous et je suis désolée que je ne peux pas parler en français, mais je vais essayer, je peux répondre à les questions en français si vous voulez. So, ça va? Yeah. Yeah, it's really an honor to join you all. And I am so interested to hear about your program and also about the interest in situating architecture within the territory. And I think this is, a fascinating kind of agenda for an architecture school. I think it's really important and it's really challenging. It's challenging, I think, to bridge the study of architecture and its history and the practice, and to kind of reconcile how one can actually practice in this way when the construction industry is so entrenched. It's so fixed in some ways. So how to bridge the desire to think about territory and the practice, what one can actually do. So that's something I think is very challenging, very interesting and important right now. So I'm gonna speak about this book project, Reciprocal Landscapes, and just focus on two of the stories, one that's about steel and one that is about wood. And please also let me know if I'm speaking, sometimes I speak too fast, so please let me know and I'll adjust. Right now I'm actually visiting family in Boston, but this is where I work in the University of Waterloo in Cambridge, Ontario. And this is the Grand River. And this is also, you can see on the left here, an image of the Grand River east of Toronto, which was land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Grand River in 1784 by the British Crown. This land was given to them, or was promised to them for their use forever. And you can see in red in the middle here, the land that they actually have tenure over right now, and the rest of it is a grand metropolitan development. And this past year, we've seen land defenders blocking new development in this area. And more recently, this past April, the Haudenosaunee chiefs declared a moratorium on development within this tract. And so I think this is a really important call for us to reflect on and take action on the relationship between development. So as a school of architecture, this is fundamental to the work that people are being trained in, and the responsibilities as treaty people, and also the intention of the moratorium is to make sure that any development in this area is done so with land stewardship. So I think these are absolutely fundamental ideas for our architecture school to engage with. And I think we haven't not yet, but something that is really important. So my research comes from practicing as a landscape architect and being really curious about, I think, as most designers are, about the materials that we're specifying, and really enjoying that process because it's such the sensual, exciting, kind of realistic moment when things come together. And being really curious about where those materials come from and what their larger stories are, and not really having much time, in practice to get the backstory. And so while we're really, focused on how these materials are performing in the design site, it's interesting to think about how the use of those materials is obviously part of this larger material flow, global material flow, and extractive capitalistic system that absolutely also makes other landscapes, that changes other landscapes. And so in some ways, the project is about trying to draw a link between these two activities. And so this graph shows the last century in the United States of material consumption. And I think it's one depiction of the relationship between GDP, so economic and political change, and material consumption. And so I think, partly it's interesting to be able to link economic regimes plus the actual consumption and use and circulation of materials, which obviously has a lot to do in this case with construction, the movement of stone aggregates and the components of concrete as well. And so we can see these alignments as, I like this succinct way that Jason Moore puts the history of recent capitalism as, quote, natures were appropriated, capital was accumulated, and wastes were dumped overboard. And so I think in this book project, the materials that I looked at really followed this trajectory as, soil is exhausted, forests are depleted, and we see forced labor and mining over extraction. And these are really the logical outcomes of a system based on having an exploitative relationship to land as if there were no limits or repercussions. So in this book, I'm looking at these 5 different materials: fertilizer, granite, steel, trees, and hardwood. And I've structured the stories so that they were all based on materials that were embedded in well-loved, well-documented New York City public landscapes. But these stories could obviously take place anywhere in the world. And in each case, I'm examining the relationships between the place where it was installed, the public landscape, and then a site of extraction, and trying to understand the relationship between the two. So these cases span 150 years. And the idea with that is to look at changing economic regimes, changing labor practices, changing design agendas, and public attitudes and designers' attitudes towards, I think, what you're talking about, this relationship between design and the territorial, and a concept of nature. And what is that relationship with the human relationship within nature? So the project has a few overlying agendas. The first is to see materials not as products. So this is a kind of thought experiment. How can we see materials as continuous with the landscapes that they come from and the livelihoods and habitats of people and other species? The second is, how do we see these unrelated, seemingly very distant places as actually co-created, absolutely entwined? So a deeper quarry in one place means material improvements in another, so an unequal ecological exchange. And then 3, how to see these material movements, from the designer or architect or landscape architect's eyes. So what are some of the kind of ideas, meanings that are being embedded in these designs, and how do they relate to the actual kind of larger global movement of materials? So we may have a design may have an idea about, idealizing human nature relationships, but how does that map on to the so-called actual one? maybe that's hard to say there is an actual one, but that's the larger idea. So this slide shows the trajectories of different materials and where they landed in New York City. And so I'll give a brief overview of the whole book, but talk about two of them in greater depth. So the first chapter, which I had the pleasure of speaking with Jean Souviron about, traces a small amount of guano fertilizer used on the lawns of Central Park in the 1860s back to the Chincha Islands of coastal Peru. And this chapter focuses on the growing metabolic rift of urbanizing centers. It touches on concerns about disconnection from local organic cycles and guano's relationship to soil exhaustion, Atlantic and Pacific slavery, and the development of the contemporary chemical lawn industrial complex. The second chapter focuses on granite blocks that were quarried in coastal Maine that were used to smooth the pavement and flow of capital in Broadway in the 1890s. So at this time, granite was being used it was the desired material for paving streets and also constructing any monuments or buildings that were considered civically important. And so the chapter focuses on how labor solidarity between quarry workers in Maine and paving layers in Manhattan disrupted the flow of granite in response to exploitative working conditions. Oops. So the third chapter, which I'll talk about a little bit more, focuses on steel. And so as granite gave way to concrete reinforced with steel was sprouting as towers, bridges, rail lines, infrastructure. And this chapter follows structural steel from Pittsburgh, on the Monongahela River, to Riverside Park on the Hudson River in Manhattan. And it looks at while steel was used to construct Riverside Park, the actual making of the steel really transformed Pittsburgh's Riverside and a constellation of other extractive landscapes. It looks at the role that steel itself played, but also focuses on progressive legislation in the construction of the new modern public landscape and the support of unionization or organized industrial labor. So this is what Riverside Park looks like, looking out on the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan today. And this is the promenade in the middle of the park. And you have to look closely, but if you do, you can see that there's a grate here. And this is actually a tunnel. There's a train running through. It's easy to miss. But when the park was originally constructed in 1874, and it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, these New York, the train tracks that you can see here were already very active, and the park was primarily on the right side of the train tracks. And this was a very active industrial landscape. The train line was bringing cattle downtown, and there was a lot of social tension here because this part of the city was gentrifying. There was a lot more kind of wealthy residences here who started to object the industrial uses and the kind of smells and unsightliness of the industrial use. And basically there was a plan to cover over these tracks, but this was interrupted by the stock market crash. So about 400 miles to the west in Pittsburgh, on the banks of the Monongahela River, there was also an industrial, highly congested industrial use, which was the growing steel industry. And here you can see Homestead, the kind of famous Homestead steelworks on either side of the river. And this was a really, strategic location for the growing steel industry. It was close to coking coal, close to Great Lakes ore routes and Midwestern markets. And so as Pittsburgh is becoming an industrial center, steel production was radically transforming the air and the water and the land. And so the river was receiving toxic industrial waste, acid mine drainage, and raw municipal sewage. And by the turn of the 20th century, there was this kind of thick black smoke from plants along the river. And many writers and poets and commentators talked about this city as a vision of hell. There were exorbitant typhoid rates, and they were disproportionately affecting Black and new immigrant residents. So, excuse me. Residents had very little access to the riverfront, and because all of the industrial development was alongside them. And so there was at some point an urban plan commissioned actually by Olmsted's son, Olmsted Jr. And he proposed or talked about the importance of actually leaving some of this riverside land accessible to the public. But ultimately the industrial companies prevailed, and the city really didn't leave very much public land by the river. And these are the two remaining furnaces. So of the Carey blast furnaces that operated until 1986. Throughout the centuries, this is the entire blast furnace, Carey furnaces. And over the century, there was pretty much a continual stream of molten iron flowing from these blast furnaces across the river to the Homestead steel mills, where they left as structural steel members and plates. This was a complex about 420 acres on both sides of the river. And this was a kind of, archetypal complex demonstrating this large-scaled integrated industrial works that was kind of the poster child of American industry in the 20th century. And this is Ron Baraff, who works for Rivers of Steel, which is an organization that works to preserve and reactivate the area's industrial structures. So he was a teenager in Pittsburgh when all of the steel works were closing down. So most of his life, he's experienced the decline of the steel works, but interestingly is, working to reactivate their story and histories. So I visited this site because I was writing this book, and I really couldn't find a clear link between the Riverside Park steel and a source. And I had found one small clue that still to me is a little bit ambiguous, that a nearby manufacturer had supplied a significant amount of steel to cover New York's central tracks at the time I was searching for. And it was in no way conclusive, but it's the link that I decided to work with for this story. And Ron, as a historian of this place, gave me some confidence that it was, as good a chance as any that it came through Homestead and the Carey blast furnaces. So the U.S. Steel, the history of U.S. Steel really demonstrates the strategies of monopoly capitalism to reorganize and control huge expanses of land and enormous labor resources. The company Carnegie Steel bought Carey furnaces in 1898 and consolidated as U.S. Steel in 1901. And this company gained control of vast ore and fuel supplies, rail networks, infrastructure, the whole deal. It's kind of overwhelming to even kind of get a grip, get your head wrapped around the scale of this empire. But evidence is everywhere. And we can see these are the iron ore pellets that we were kind of walking on. And so they provided a good, basis for starting to piece together this network of extraction. So Ron and I are walking through the former ore yard, and we're picking up different granules from the ground. So there were pieces of iron ore, like here in this photo. There was coking coal, and also chalky limestone, which are the three precursors of iron. And we also found aerated slag, which had been skimmed off the top in the making of iron and then disposed. So the iron ore pellets came from Minnesota, the Mesabi Range, which is a 110-mile long ribbon that settled in that region about 2 billion years earlier. And so this settling occurred when photosynthetic cyanobacteria released huge, spectacular amounts of dioxygen into the Earth's no oxygen environment, and basically dissolved hematite, rusted, and with this oxygen, and fell and settled on the ocean floor in these huge bands, I love this term, the rusting of the Earth, which is the dramatic process that it's known by. So where these banded iron formations ended up near the Earth's surface, speculators saw a profitable material resource. And this really became the linchpin of the 20th century industrialization of steel. And so by the time, so these tracks provided about 3/4 of US steel's ore and 1 billion tons by the time that Riverside Park was completed. So we've got the ore, next was the transport. And so the corporation bought steamships, rail systems to get the ore to Pittsburgh. So this is the Minnesota kind of range. So the next step was coking coal from Connellsville, which was the primary fuel. It burns hotter than coal and can melt iron ore. So it serves as a reducing agent and also a structural material in the blast furnace. So the company partnered with Henry Frick, gained control of 2/3 of the region's coal reserves. And then the third precursor is limestone, which serves as flux. So a reducing agent that draws out the impurities of the iron ore, binding with it to become slag. And so by the turn of the century, the company owned 3/4 of the Pittsburgh Limestone Company and operated quarries all over the place. So there were these continual streams of ore, coke, and limestone flowing towards the Cary furnaces, and each step, an integral part of this integrated steelworks. So Ron takes me through the abandoned steelworks, and he's able to describe them as if they were, active, as if they were still running. And he explains how the ore, limestone, and coke would go up these the furnaces and carts, and then would be tipped down into the furnaces. And as they were falling, the iron is melting, it's being collected at the bottom, and limestone is binding the non-metallic minerals into this foamy slag, which floats on top and then is skimmed off the top, and then deposited in a landfill site, which is now a huge hill in Pittsburgh. And then what was molten iron would head across the river to the Olmsted Steelworks, where it would be mixed with scrap steel, limestone, and other additives, and would be cast into ingots and then shaped and rolled, and then further sent downriver or upriver to the American Bridge Company in nearby Ambridge, where it was cut, welded, assembled, and shipped. So by the 1920s, a quarter of national steel production in the US was headed to the New York region, as all of these buildings and infrastructure were being constructed. Wall Street solidified as a global financial center, and industrialists and developers were multiplying fortunes in towers, both as real estate speculation and as the site of real estate speculation. And this speculation is part of the movement that leads to the market crash of 1929. So of the many WPA infrastructural projects that emerged through New Deal administration, what we're looking at here is the Robert Moses-led West Side Improvement, which is a kind of weaving together of a number of different infrastructural projects in Manhattan, and was the city's largest. And it also includes what we're looking at, which is the renovation of Riverside Park. And it's important to note that this also included a discriminatory cost savings. So Robert Moses prioritized park spending in the area where the wealthiest and whitest residents lived, and spent just a fraction of that north of 125th Street, where the population was poor and where Black communities were concentrated. So these kinds of calculations really freed up a lot of money, and was the kind of basis of these projects. So the roofing of the rail tracks, the expansion and filling of the shoreline, the smoothing of the grade between Riverside Drive and the Hudson River produced about 53 new hectares of parkland. So steel workers installed prefabricated rigid steel frames made of plates and angles. They riveted them in intricate patterns alongside the river's edge. And once the roofing was complete, then there were obviously highway construction, topography, and planting were installed. And this was a really important precedent, or let's say indicator of this new public landscape, a modern public landscape, which was integrating highway and parkland, and asserting this new kind of seamless, smooth, active public landscape. And this is a photo from the brochure, which commemorates the park opening. And I love this because it's kind of very mysterious, and is saying up above this track is this park, trees, grass, and sunlight. And so in the same year that Riverside Park's renovation was completed, which was prompted by New Deal legislation, US Steel shocked the nation by signing an agreement that recognized full union representation, establishing an 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week, and grievance procedures, indicating the growing power of industrial unionism. So this, simultaneous completion of Riverside Park and the signing of US Steel's labor agreement reflect this critical moment when power between industrial corporations and the public was radically reorganized, physically and socially, and steel was this kind of major agent in that. So the chapter goes on to explore how both places evolved. Here in New York City, as the rail line is abandoned in the 1980s and becomes home to a community of people whose story maybe some of you are familiar with through the film Dark Days. And also in Pittsburgh, as the steel industry leaves the city, taking jobs and leaving brownfield sites with it. So that's the third chapter. This is the fourth chapter, which looks at street tree nursery production, and it focuses on these beautiful London plane trees that you can find all over Manhattan. And it looks at a community-driven planting of these trees on 7th Avenue in Harlem and at the Rikers Island Tree Nursery. So the Rikers Island is a kind of well-known, notorious incarceration complex. And it looks at the interdependencies between urban street trees and residents who breathe near them and advocate for them. And also focuses on the long-term collective rearing of these trees by unpaid incarcerated workers. So are we doing okay with my speed? And is it okay? Do you recommend a slowing down or a speeding up? Okay.
I think it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so then the last chapter, which I'll go into a little bit more depth again, is about Ipe. So the slow-growing deciduous tree, is this a popular wood in Paris? I'm only seeing Frederic and Paul. Is this something that the people are using?
It's known, but not so much used, I think, but it's okay. Known. And I think the name is the same, IP.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So if you're familiar with it, you would know it, or for it's incredibly beautiful. It's so durable, so hard, and very rot resistant. And so insect and rot resistant. So it's very desirable for outdoor applications, for public landscapes, especially kind of, higher budget, because it's quite expensive, public landscapes. And so I'm looking at tracing the use of it in the first phase of the High Line back to its origin in northern Brazil. So I start by thinking about decay, forest decay, as this essential process of ecosystem cycling. And, the beauty of, or the essential, function of decay in a forest ecosystem. But then thinking about when it comes to lumber, that decay is this problem or something to slow down in an otherwise ideal building material. And so in the US, coastal redwood was this incredible decay resistant wood, wonderful wood. It's, incredibly beautiful, versatile, easy to work with. It's fire resistant and tough on fungi and insects. And so this is a very well-known story that coastal redwood was notoriously over-harvested. They were magnificent, huge part of the Pacific coast, but were basically, extirpated or made completely cut. And it was used, for all kinds of applications. It was incredible for, well-loved for luxury interiors, but was also the basis for new lower-cost suburban housing, workers' bungalows, infrastructure, large stadiums. So it was being used for everything. It was used for mine shafts and exported as well. And this is a report from the 1930s, which claimed that there was just so much of it. It's just like there's so much of it that it's not possible to overuse it. It's just going to keep coming. And here you can look at different ways that coastal redwood was being advertised based on its ancient, its connection to deep time, the romance and mystery of old living things. And so it's really being marketed based on its status as a living thing. So there's a kind of irony there. And at the same time, we can look at mahogany, the history of mahogany use, which was another prized and very durable wood available at the time. So following colonial trade routes through West Africa and the Caribbean. And here we can see how it was marketed to North Americans through colonial aesthetics. And, you know, there's also this kind of idea of plenty, of kind of unending plenty. And as we know, mahogany was really over harvested and became generally, so this study shows extirpation or kind of assumed extinction in these areas, in these kind of harvesting regions in southern Brazil. So as the surge of redwood found its way into many types of construction, it also became this really key element of modern domestic life. So the new residential deck in California, in kind of Californian modern architecture. So modern landscape architects were using decks to unite the inside and outside. And here the landscape architect Thomas Church even was promoting and acting as a spokesman for the California Redwood Association. And here he's in this advertisement, he's saying how much, you know, it's his favorite material, it can do anything, fully on board. And then here we see an ad from 1973 where the company is suggesting that even if you are making a bench that needs to last for 100 years, think about this wood, which is 1,000 years old. So just this really, you know, incredible marketing based on the idea of unlimited supplies, and even kind of an encouragement to use it, to not even take advantage of the age of it. So California redwood populations dwindled, and by the 1980s, populations were basically decimated, and chemically treated softwoods entered the decking market. So pressure treated wood preserved with chromated copper arsenic was affordable, reliable, and everywhere in playground structures and suburban decks. So it was good, you know, it combated rot, but it also leached highly toxic compounds into soil, water, and people's bodies. And so by 2003, the Environmental Protection Agency had called for a voluntary ban on using lumber treated with this, with CCA. And around this time, local hardwood prices rose, and tropical lumber imports to the United States increased by 400%. So here in these ads, you can start to see benches and furniture offered in teak, ipe, mahogany, and purple heart from South America. And designers had, you know, newly had access to previously unheard of woods, and they seemed kind of like a win-win, because they had properties that were better than domestic redwood, but they also didn't have toxic chemical treatment. So, and they were, you know, this kind of big wave of access was happening. And so when the first phase of the High Line was constructed on the obsolete elevated rail line, so of the West Side Improvement, so connecting back to the chapter on steel, the same rail line, ipe wood was the wood, kind of the best practice wood of choice for the decks and the step seating and the furniture for this project. It's, you know, exceptionally durable, and resistance to decay really made it incredibly popular. One of the most popular types of commercial wood for higher end residential decks, parks, and boardwalks. And kind of similar to old growth redwood, it's very slow growing. And so its use is controversial because it raises questions about the sustainability of its harvest. So about 4 months after the High Line opened, activists from Rainforests of New York hung this banner, which challenged the sustainability of tropical hardwood certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. or FSC. And the campaign opposed the use of tropical hardwoods like ipe in public landscapes. And they basically made this, their point was New York City is the largest municipal consumer of tropical hardwoods in North America, and they should kind of come to terms with what that means. So this is Belém in the northern tip of the Brazilian Amazon. And this is a port where valuable goods from the Amazon have always flowed out of the country. So whether that's rubber, cacao, or lumber, this has been a really key site of kind of export. And I was lucky enough to meet up with Marley Nogueira from the Instituto Floresta Tropical, which is an independent sustainable forestry research and training organization. And he offered to show me some ipe in the forest plot a few hours upriver. So Marley cleared a path to this purple ipe, about 1.5 meters wide and about 40 meters tall. And this is one of several species that make up the trade name of ipe. And they're found from the Brazilian Amazon to Mexico. They appear at extremely low densities. So one mature tree is found just every 3 to 10 hectares. And they have these very tiny winged seeds that get caught when they fall, they get caught in foliage, and they're really gobbled up quickly by animals on the forest floor. And so if they do get established, they require a lot of really specific lighting to survive. And so all of these ecological traits, along with the fact that they grow really slowly, means that they make a population of very few large, older adults and very few juveniles. So all of these together, and also the fact that it's has a high dollar value, make it very vulnerable to both legal and illegal overharvesting. So Marley explains, that, or here he's trying to show me that it's like that this material is so tough, and he's like, try to rip it, and I cannot rip it, and it's got this just incredible fiber, and he explains to me that this leaf, or that ipe was chosen as the emblem for their sustainable forestry organization because it really represents the current crisis. So the desire for highly valuable but very sparsely distributed trees like ipe exacerbate deforestation. So they push the logging frontier further into unlogged forests. So they're so valuable that it's worth it to go deeper into quite a dense forest to get them. And in so doing, they kind of create a path for more exploitation. They open up roads, they open up, they essentially make more land vulnerable to overharvesting. They catalyze road construction and agricultural production. So mahogany has very similar ecological characteristics, and as I mentioned before, became endangered in the 1980s. So it became protected, and as the ecologist Mark Schultz writes, ipe is basically the new mahogany. So it just follows the same. Basically, the market's kind of shifted to this new material, and the same kind of overharvesting and destruction has kind of followed suit, just a new product. So logging companies have to produce a sustainable forestry management plan and follow restrictions about the number and types of trees that can be harvested. And here you can see the sawmills in the north of Belém processing logs that arrive by river and road from different regions of the Amazon. So US distributors purchase sawn wood and ship it directly from Brazilian mills to New York City's port. And each shipment of sawn lumber is associated with a unique number and a set of documents. So according to the government, this mechanism is supposed to control illegal logging and curtail deforestation, making it difficult for illegal logging. And here we see different, on the way back from the field trip, we see trucks of logs being stopped to check paperwork. But at the same time, this document, this legal documents, Marley tells me, is a way that can facilitate also the concealment of illegal logging. So it's kind of impossible to really understand the extent of illegal logging. And as well the labor conditions that surround it. In some cases, illegal logging activities include what's known as debt slavery. And in the northern state of Pará in Brazil, there are an estimated 25,000 people working in landscape conversion. So this includes, agriculture, but also illegal logging. And so these people are living in the state of forced labor. So the chapter gets into different perspectives on wood certification, including this perspective of ecologists who suggest that with reduced, even if logging were reduced, it's really not possible to sustain the production of ipe lumber under current so-called sustainable harvest levels. And so they recommend further protection of the species, similar to what mahogany was granted, as well as imagining silvicultural techniques that could improve the chances of seedling survival. So kind of agroforestry types of techniques. So these are the experimental plots surrounding the forest management center that I visited. And these, basically it's a form of cultivation within a forest. And so the idea is to test the possibility of a more cultivated ipe type of kind of gardening as a way to make the commercial harvest of ipe more tenable. So future phases of the High Line, so we're looking at phase 2, I believe, used instead reclaimed materials, reclaimed teak and other salvaged hardwoods. And soon after, the New York City Parks Department announced a moratorium on old growth tropical lumber for public parks. And we can also see a move towards the use of reclaimed lumber, like here in Brooklyn Bridge Park by Michael van Valkenburg and Associates, and also a growing use of black locust, which is a fast-growing domestic rot-resistant wood. And so really this chapter contrasts the slow growth, this like incredibly slow ecological, conditions and growth patterns of this set of species known as ipe, against the fast rate of obsolescence and development in neoliberal Manhattan. So as High Line becomes a symbol of an archetypal neoliberal space. So in the steel chapter, that history really brings forward how public landscapes, institutions, and jobs give way to more privatized arrangements in the neoliberal city. And so this is all happening, in the High Line, or the realm of projects occurring surrounding the High Line are really an aesthetics of obsolescence in the reused steel structures of a relocated industry. So, these tropical hardwoods, and we're looking at here the boardwalk made of ipe, teak, and kumaru. They really, gained love because of their ability to withstand decades of tough weather. But this is a photo following Superstorm Sandy, when a lot of these boardwalks were just kind of, crushed in an instant. And I think this image is a bit of a reminder of how easily that which seems durable can be really kind of crushed in the face of climate-driven weather events. So back to decay. If you're looking at, wood decaying over time, you first notice this kind of softening of the surface and the slow digestion of the outer fibers, and then later the wood getting either spongy or brittle before it eventually surrenders and falls apart. So this is a kind of, a sign of failure from some perspectives. But of course, we know that this ability to degrade is also what makes wood wood, and why it's such a unique and important building material in a palette of conventional construction materials. So sapwood cells have their own mechanisms of defense, but ultimately they give way, and their demise ends up supporting the forest as a whole, cycling carbon and other nutrients through the soil. And so their fragility is also their future strength. I think that observing decay and kind of reflecting on decay is this reminder of the relationships that allow ecological systems to thrive, endure, and regrow. And it's also a useful metaphor for thinking about how and what to construct with in this time. We can think about the prior life and design for the afterlife of the materials that we engage with. But at the same time, it's, that it's a metaphor, it's also not at all. It's also just one of the pathways that sustains human life and all life that we all depend on. So I'll just end there. The purpose of this project, from my point of view, was a bit of a thought exercise to really think about materials not as products or beyond their role as products, to see continuities and connections. And I really just end with questions about how to support these connections as, coming from a design discipline, how to support mutually beneficial relationships, and how to form solidarities with people and other species and other landscapes as a kind of basis of the discipline. So thank you so much for your joining, and looking forward to talking with you all.
Thank you very much, Jane. We can begin with question. Does anyone has a question or a remark?
Actually, I have. I was wondering the kind of wood you were talking about. Do you know how long it takes for a tree to grow enough in order to be used in construction?
I think a lot of like the tree that I showed, I think was about 100 years old. That was like an estimate. I think you can harvest at like 40 or 50. But it's, there are older trees. So, and I think that's an interesting question also, to when you're working with wood and harvested wood, to think about the fact that the slower growth is also why, the slower growth contributes to the properties that make it desirable. So you can also, like there's second growth redwood available now. It obviously doesn't have the same properties as the old growth redwood. It's not as hard. It's not, it doesn't, it's cellulose comes together faster. So it doesn't have the same properties. So yeah, it's an interesting point that some of these properties you can't speed up, it's a different material. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
So not renewable at a human scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, like, is it, or maybe or maybe we think about multiple human scales or multiple generations. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's harder to invest in it if it's not going to be interesting before 100 years. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I have a question for you. In your in the introduction of your book, you describe Robert Smithson's work on site. How this artwork triggered your research?
Yeah, I think for me it was such a useful inversion. Like it kind of, his non-sites, just even through the naming of them, highlight the distance between what's, the art in the gallery and then the quarry or the landfill, the kind of faraway place. And so by calling the gallery the non-site, it kind of reminded me as a designer how kind of like precious and gallery focused the landscape architecture projects that I was used to thinking about were. It reminded me that they were I was seeing them very much in a kind of vacuum as I guess it made me more aware of the kind of value and attention that tends to be paid to very discrete things without looking at all of the things that are actually contributing to them. So yeah, I just find that conceptually a really useful challenge to flip that on its head, and also to bring them together as well. Like, what does it mean to actually, to force yourself to, as I think, kind of thought experiment, to say obviously they are related. It's the same actual physical material, but they seem so far apart. So to use that as a bit of a challenge to try to generate a thicker understanding of how they're related. I'm so curious if are there other examples? I mean, I know there would be infinite other examples. That's like one artist practice, but I'm curious if other people have other frameworks that they find useful. I would love to hear.
And did you read? I suppose you read William Cronon. When I was discovering your book, I had this reference in mind, and is this a reference for you?
Yeah, I really I learned so much from reading his work, and I also think maybe coming across Matthew Gandy's work about his book called Concrete and Clay about New York City, and then reading William Cronon on Chicago, that for me really, similarly kind of flipped my understanding of what a city is and how, what we pay attention to. So William Cronon really helps you understand the Chicago existing because of forests, because of the forests that we're able to that were exploited and kind of allowed for all of the other changes to occur. So yeah, I think that's a really powerful work. Yeah. I'm so curious also what kind of work people here are, if there's like kind of similar avenues, or anyways, feel free to share what you're working on too. That's always a really, someone's sneezing a lot in my house.
As we were saying at the beginning, maybe our students are a little shy in English. I don't know.
I should be the shy one.
Éventuellement en français, si vous me le permettez, ce sera plus agréable pour moi. Merci beaucoup. Je trouvais que c'était passionnant. Enfin, c'est aussi super important pour nous parce qu'on voit qu'il y a tout un champ là de l'histoire de l'architecture et de l'urbanisme avec une approche assez matérialiste, on pourrait dire, hein, où on va voir, creuser derrière, etc. Ces images en miroir de à la fois ce qui se construit dans les grandes capitales, et métropoles, et puis tous ces sites d'extraction, etc. Je me demandais, alors j'avais en tête un ouvrage que j'ai sur mon bureau là que j'ai pas encore lu, qui s'appelle Materialism and the Critique of Energy de Diamenti, Brent, Ryan. Et moi, je travaille sur les infrastructures énergétiques, comme vous disiez tout à l'heure. Je serais curieuse de savoir ce sur quoi certains et certaines travaillent. Mais je me demandais comment vous croisez à la fois cette approche très histoire de l'environnement, histoire de l'urbanisme, etc., avec peut-être des références du côté, alors je ne sais pas si c'est histoire et philosophie des techniques, mais cette nouvelle, j'ai l'impression qu'il y a pas mal de chercheurs, de chercheuses aujourd'hui qui réutilisent aussi cette notion de matérialisme un peu critique, matérialisme et spatialité critique de l'énergie, de l'environnement. Est-ce que, pour partager peut-être avec nous des éléments de vos bibliographies, où tu parlais de Cronon tout à l'heure, Frédéric, de ces gens qui nourrissent un peu ces nouvelles histoires? Alors moi, je pensais à Diamenti que j'ai découvert il n'y a pas très longtemps, parce que je travaille aussi sur le numérique, sur l'impact énergétique et spatial des centres de données, sur la façon dont les infrastructures de l'énergie, en particulier les objets de l'électricité, ont complètement transformé les territoires, etc. Et j'ai découvert cet auteur il n'y a pas longtemps qui travaille aussi là-dessus. Ça me fait penser aussi à une collègue sur les territoires du pétrole dont j'ai oublié le nom. Paul, toi tu sais, Frédéric aussi, non, qui était dans l'HDR de Paul Landwehr.
Carolina Hein.
Voilà, Carolina Hein. Carola Hein, voilà. Donc il y a toute une constellation, je trouve, comme ça, de personnalités qui s'intéressent à tout ça. Et voilà, c'était, si vous aviez des éléments un peu de référence, ou d'autres, un peu cette constellation comme ça de chercheurs, chercheuses qui ont cette approche assez matérialiste, critique des spatialités, qu'elles soient énergétiques, territoriales, environnementales, et qui croisent justement souvent ces différentes approches. Parce que c'est vrai qu'avec votre regard aussi, évidemment anglo-saxon, enfin Canada, etc., nous, dans nos écoles françaises, même si on regarde aussi ces territoires, je me dis que ça peut être intéressant de voir qui. Voilà.
I'm very motivated right now to make that bibliography. Now that you mentioned this, I think I would love to come back to you. I would love to kind of gather, because I don't think I have it offhand. And I'm writing down some of the references you're mentioning. I haven't read Diamenti, but it's on my list. I think, there are so many. I think there are lots of people looking at different material histories. I've come across, I'm thinking about, even in Canada, Alessandro Ponte has been looking at kind of mining sites and the relationship to kind of Canadian nation. Oh, Alessandro Ponte at the Université de Montréal.
Okay.
Comes to mind. Mimi Scheller's book on aluminum is so fascinating. I think, there are a lot of, I guess, coming from urban geography and someone that I think is pretty fascinating is Stephen Bunker, who studied kind of material flows, especially focusing on the Amazon. So from a kind of world systems perspective, I think his work is a really kind of fundamental, a great place to look at kind of larger global material flows. Martin Arboleda's book, The Planetary Mind. But I think I'm kind of this is maybe a little bit random and you're really, I'm like, what is the bibliography? I would really like to assemble that. Maybe we could do it together.
Non, mais c'est intéressant. Yeah. Merci, c'était pour partager quelques références qui
oui, exactement.
Ces nouvelles histoires et de voir si on a un peu les mêmes. Enfin, vous avez cité beaucoup de noms que je ne connais pas, donc je trouve que c'est aussi enrichissant pour nous, même si ce n'est pas évident comme question. Et pardon si c'était un peu maladroit, mais je trouve que c'est intéressant. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Jean-François Blassel, je veux bien intervenir. Vas-y, Jean-François.
Alors, ce n'est pas Jean-François.
Ah, pardon, JFB. Ah, ben non. Ah, salut.
Bonjour.
Jean-Baptiste Fressoz.
Shall I speak in English or in French, as you wish? I mean, if your French is okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean, ce que je trouve vraiment passionnant dans ce que font les historiens d'architecture, historiens d'urbanisme en ce moment, c'est justement en regardant une ville, ils regardent tout plein de matériaux qui ne sont jamais étudiés par les historiens. C'est pour ça que ce que vous faites est vraiment original et intéressant. Enfin, si on prend l'histoire la façon dont les historiens traitent la matière, en général, on a une histoire qui est monomatérialiste. Vous avez un historien qui est historien du charbon, un autre qui est historien du pétrole, un autre qui va être historien du bois, historien de l'aluminium, historien du fer, historien de l'acier, etc., etc. Et quand on regarde une ville, en fait, on est obligé de regarder tout plein de matériaux ensemble. Et c'est cette vision symbiotique des énergies et des matériaux que je trouve vraiment originale et rafraîchissante d'un point de vue historique. D'un point de vue général, l'historiographie en général, depuis les années 70, en fait, cette affaire remonte sans doute à avant, mais je pense à Eduardo Galeano, Las Veinas Abiertas d'América Latine. Il y a eu beaucoup de travaux sur l'échange écologique inégal. Donc, c'est une littérature qui commence dans les années 70. Ça a, à mon avis, eu trop d'influence sur l'historiographie, c'est-à-dire ça a trop influencé notre compréhension des phénomènes. Et d'ailleurs, ce que vous décrivez bien sur la fin du 19e siècle, c'est une exploitation intensive du territoire américain avant de penser à l'exploitation d'autres pays. Et je pense que ça, c'est vraiment important d'avoir une chronologie un peu précise et de voir que les pays riches, jusqu'à assez tard en fait, dans le 20e siècle, sont des pays qui sont des pays extractivistes. Et que les plus grands, enfin les pays les plus riches sont aussi les pays où il y a le plus de mines, où il y a le plus de forêts exploitées, etc. etc. Mais voilà, donc ça c'est un point important. C'est pour ça que je suis un peu plus sceptique sur la référence que vous faites par exemple à Jason Moore, etc., où à mon avis on a une vision beaucoup trop centre-périphérie de cette affaire, de cette vision du matérialisme du capitalisme, quoi. Ou en tout cas qui marche bien sur l'Europe du second XXe siècle, mais qui marche beaucoup moins bien sur les États-Unis du début du XXe siècle, par exemple. En tout cas, merci pour les travaux que vous faites et ce genre d'approche matérielle de la ville, c'est vraiment très utile pour les historiens. I don't know if I was clear. I tend to speak very quickly, so I mean,
je pense que j'ai entendu. Thank you. Merci
my main point would be that when you focus on a whole city, of course, you integrate a lot of materials, whereas historians tend to focus on one material through time, and you have a much more symbiotic relationship of material and energies at a given period. And that's why it's very important for the historiography, what is being done right now.
Thank you so much for the comment. I really like if I understood correctly, the Eduardo Galeano reference in terms of, like, I think about what is that view, which is really about, a continent, a globe, a century, intersecting with the kind of specificity you're talking about and that historians often bring to a single material. I think and I can't remember how, maybe that plus even more of a biological or kind of ecological perspective, I think, is how these intersect, I think can be very rich. Thank you for the comment.
Oui, je poserai bien une question. Merci Jane pour cette conférence effectivement très, très intéressante. Donc, je crois savoir que vous êtes paysagiste, landscape architect, c'est ça? Que vous êtes enseignante?
Oui. Je travaille dans une école d'architecture maintenant.
D'accord. Et donc, je voudrais savoir comment ce travail d'histoire, de recherche, influence et nourrit à la fois votre pratique de paysagiste
Oui.
et votre enseignement de projet, et également de savoir si, selon vous, il y a aujourd'hui des architectes, des paysagistes, des urbanistes qui développent des démarches qui seraient particulièrement attentives ou vertueuses au regard des questions qui vous importent.
Is it if there are practices that are doing kind of addressing the question of material relationships that, I think there are, and I think I'm very interested in learning more about that. I mean, I think, some of one of the projects I showed, this Brooklyn Bridge Park by Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates, that's an example of a landscape architecture firm really kind of committing to material experimentation. So one of their, that firm has been presenting in national conferences talking about this material, about black locust, or, really kind of trying to explore alternatives to tropical hardwoods. So they're teaching about it, they're talking about it, they're advocating for it. So I think that's one example. I kind of think everybody is trying to do this in different ways. I think the problems of material, like the embodied carbon, the so many glaring problems with the way that construction, like conventional construction materials work, is very, very present. I think everyone is talking about this. And so I think in some ways, like, I'm curious how, there are certain building industry metrics, systems like LEED and BREEAM and these forms of evaluation systems that are offered, and I think very important. I think in architecture schools and design schools, there's also an opportunity to think beyond them, or like critique them and think about what is not being captured in those industry-driven systems. So it's a good question. It's something I would like to learn more about. I think there's I would say every practitioner that I talk to is kind of doing this in different ways, looking to source. I think for me, a really interesting area is there's a lot more interest and work being done on repurposing materials, like kind of reusing salvage materials. And I think in some ways, and maybe in landscape architecture, this is always happening. A site is a landscape, you're always entering into an existing site that already has land in it. There's an inherent kind of assessment of the existing values of what's there. And so I see a lot of landscape architects talking about that. But it's a great question. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you.
Paul, tu veux poser une question?
Oui, je veux bien essayer. Je peux le faire en anglais pour être sûr d'être compris. Thank you for your lecture, Jane. And I'm, like my colleagues, really fascinated by the approach you develop. And my question is on the way you situate or inscribe your work in the bigger picture. How to connect this type of history focused on the circulations of construction materials, be they used in buildings or in public spaces, how to connect this to the classical history of architecture, more concerned with the history of form, of architects, of their designs. Are they separated histories, or should they converge? Should they form a common narrative? And if they should, how should they?
This is not your question, ça c'est, is it, est-ce que c'est?
This is mine, yes.
Okay. I think you have an answer, right?
I have mine, but I want to hear yours.
Oh yeah. Well, I think they should converge, and I think it's less that. I think it's more just about uncovering how they always have converged. You know, I think it's a kind of maybe the practice and the focus has been on form, but I think if you look at any of that form, you can find ecological connections. You find like any construction is about a relationship to land and materials and indigenous people and colonization. Like I think there's no formal question that can be separated from that. And so I think to focus on the territory and politics of the form of architecture will always, I don't think that takes you away from, I don't think that means abandoning the interest or kind of significance of architecture as a cultural entity. I think what's impossible is to separate politics and ecology from culture. And so I think it will only deepen our understanding of what culture is. It will only provide more insights to the subject matter. And I think it's always been there in different ways, but I think merge it.
Je prolongerai bien la question de Paul. Vous avez bien entendu, derrière toute question de forme ou d'architecture, on peut trouver des questions de politique, d'environnement, d'écologie. Mais est-ce que l'inverse est vrai? C'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'à partir des questions environnementales, politiques, écologiques, etc., on arrive à remonter nécessairement à des questions de forme et d'architecture?
Est-ce que vous pouvez dire une autre fois? Je n'ai pas totalement compris.
Vous dites que à travers toute question de forme et d'architecture, on peut trouver une dimension écologique ou politique. Mais ce qui serait intéressant, c'est de voir si réciproquement, lorsqu'on traite de sujets d'aménagement par l'environnement et la politique, est-ce que ça renvoie à des questions de forme? J'ai l'impression qu'on sait plus facilement voir les origines ou le feedback politique et environnemental dans des aménagements, mais à partir d'une analyse environnementale et politique, je trouve qu'il est plus difficile d'en tirer des conséquences ou des prolongements en termes de forme, de design.
Okay. Maybe I'll say it and then others can tell me if I'm getting it right. That it becomes harder to understand how to intervene as a designer in a way that's meaningful. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is very interesting. So maybe does it challenge, it opens up a question of what is the form? Is that right? Yeah, like it inherently means that that design would change if there were, like, let's say, this is quite vague, but as were I a practicing landscape architect, I would say, okay, I want to design and work with landscapes in ways that support, other landscapes. So I want to work with materials that regenerate, that improve or kind of improve soil quality, or that support indigenous land practices, or that support indigenous sovereignty. Where I am in Canada, that's an important thing. The idea that we would try to do things in such a way that there would be kind of regeneration of land and human land relationships. So yeah, what form does that make? Like what? I don't know, but I think those are interesting questions to me. How the form ends up changing. I don't think it's obviously no very specific answer, but it would cause, like for example, a practice that is going to be highly based on salvaged materials. Like, I think this is a very interesting, important thing that architects are working on now. Inherently, that changes the construction process, it changes the materiality, it changes the forms that are possible, and I think in very exciting ways. It's not going to look the same as if you were using new materials. But to me, this is probably the most such an exciting design challenge. Like, that's what we actually need to figure out. It's not obvious. And I think if I was in school right now, that's what I would want to be working on. Merci beaucoup pour les questions.
Merci. Maybe, Jen, this last answer could be an advice for students, the students that are still here. As far as I am concerned, and I think for Fanny and Paul also, it could be an idea that we will carry in our seminar, and it also could be the conclusion for this moment. Nous vous remercions beaucoup de votre générosité et de vos idées, et nous allons conclure cette séance en annonçant la prochaine conférence qui aura lieu mardi prochain. Le mardi 19 avril, nous accueillerons Anna Rossellini, qui est historienne de l'architecture et qui enseigne dans notre école ainsi qu'à l'université de Bologne, et qui nous donnera une conférence intitulée Madeleine Vriesendorp ou l'inconscient de l'Office for Metropolitan Architecture. Voilà, nous vous remercions toutes et tous. Merci encore une fois, Jane, et puis à bientôt.
Merci.
Many thanks. It was so great. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Bye.
Au revoir.